Most people aren't interested in just one topic.
Don't settle for a podcast about just one subject. That rhymed.
Greetings. We're Technically a Conversation, a podcast for curious people by curious people.
On our podcast, we do things just a little bit different.
Every week, we share a new topic, and the other hosts have no idea what the topic will be.
Our topics are all over the place, from light and funny to dark and sometimes spooky.
We've covered everything from true crime, historical events and people, the supernatural and the occult.
I like that.
Urban legends and folklore.
My favorite.
No matter what we cover, we try to make the episodes interesting and funny.
Don't mean to be the bad guy, but our lawyer said we legally couldn't call our show funny.
We have a lawyer?
Let me tell you what I told our lawyer. Come here so I can show you how far I can legally stick my high-heeled boot up your...
Check us out at technicallyaconversation.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Technically a Conversation.
We're like a lifestyle brand.
Yeah.
A couple of quick announcements before we begin. Morbid Meditations are now available for purchase on Patreon. These remain free to all patrons. If you don't want to become a patron, but you do want me to guide you through a calm cemetery or a shipwreck or help you relax for sleep, you can purchase some of these meditations. Also, I'll be releasing a few morbid ambience tracks exclusively on the MCP's YouTube channel and on Patreon. These feature nature sounds and some of the more relaxing MCP music. They're great for studying or sleeping. Basically, we could all use some help relaxing these days, and I want to assist you as best I can. And now, on with the episode. This episode contains discussions of imprisonment, torture, rape, suicide, self-harm, racism, cruel and unusual punishment, and executions. If these aren't things you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Australian history is interwoven with its role as a British Empire prison colony. During the British Industrial Revolution, workhouses were full, petty crime was at an all-time high, and prisons were overcrowded to the point of crisis. When Captain James Cook claimed Australia in the name of the King, the decision was made to ship the excess prison population to the new and distant shores of Australia. Thus began the colonization of Australia and the displacement of its indigenous peoples. The first convict ships arrived in Botany Bay, now Sydney, in 1788. Over the next 30 or so years, convicts were housed in the colonial community. Initially, they lived in tents until barracks were built in about 1820. Convicts worked part of the day for the government and the rest for cash to pay their rent. During this early period, prisoners in the penal colonies were mostly transported convicts rather than individuals convicted of an offense in Australia. The first actual jail facilities were constructed from timber in 1797, one in Sydney and one at Parramatta. Each had 22 cells, and both were burned down by unknown arsonists in the same year. They were replaced by more substantial sandstone dormitory-like buildings. In the 1800s, the demand for labor resulted in a system of assigned service, where convicts were assigned to private masters without pay, similar to slaves or indentured servants. This practice didn't end until 1838. Before 1820 in Sydney, prisoners lived in their own homes and could operate businesses from home. Their households provided room and board, and in many cases employment for later convict arrivals. after 1820, when more substantial prison barracks and facilities had been built, prisoners were kept out of the general population. The first convict ships to land in the state of Victoria, which was at the time still part of New South Wales, arrived in 1803. After several attempts at establishing a penal settlement, the Port Phillip district was sanctioned in 1837. Port Phillip's first jail was basically a hut surrounded by a 2.4-meter fence. It was burned to the ground in 1838, so Captain William Lonsdale, then manager of the Port Phillip settlement, rented a stone building to serve as a prison. Despite his best intentions, the conditions inside the building were terrible. It was about 10 by 10 feet, poorly ventilated, filthy, and overcrowded. A new jail facility was completed in 1840 to replace the stone building. The new jail was designed so it was easier to supervise the prisoners, and so the jailer was more comfortable. The jail included 2 buildings with solitary cells, a high surrounding fence, and a treadmill used for punishment. I'll explain what this is in a moment. For a while, this facility worked well, but when the population of Port Phillip swelled from around 250 to 23,800 between 1836 and 1842, the need for a more permanent and substantial jail became urgent. Government officials in Sydney drew up plans for a new Melbourne jail, which would sit at the top of the Russell Street Hill, right in the middle of the settlement. The facility included many of the new prison reforms that were in effect in England at the time. This includes more individual cells, better ventilation, natural light, and space to exercise. In December of 1851, there were 29 people in prison in the whole state of Victoria. 2 years later, there were 955. Another population boom had occurred thanks to the Victorian gold rush. The discovery of gold in multiple locations around Melbourne brought both Australians and immigrants to the area. Ex-convicts from other parts of the country, settlers, and Chinese immigrants all rushed to make their fortunes in Victoria. At its peak, some 2 tons of gold per week flowed into the Treasury building in Melbourne. The exported gold paid off all of Britain's foreign debts and contributed to its enormous commercial and colonial expansion in the late 1800s. Melbourne became a boomtown, with rail networks radiating from its center into regional towns and ports. Politics expanded to manage the town and the issues that come with population growth, such as land protections, taxes, and sanitation. By 1854, immigrants from China arrived to make their fortune. Competition with Australian miners unfortunately resulted in riots, killings, and segregation, which often resulted in prison sentences. It was this strife that drove the White Australia policy, a set of racist policies that aimed to forbid people of non-European ethnic origins from immigrating to Australia. In short, the Victorian gold rush was a revolutionary event that reshaped Victoria, and part of that was prison overcrowding. The Victorian government came up with what they thought would be a solution to prison overcrowding. They decided to use large ships as prisons. These were called prison hulks. In 1852, a ship named President was fitted out as a floating prison. By the end of 1852, the Deborah, the Success, and the Sacramento were also functioning as prison hulks. In total, 7 ships had their masts removed and were anchored off Williamstown on Hobson's Bay as prison hulks. The hulks were reserved for the worst offenders in Australia and therefore designed to strike fear into any would-be criminal. Conditions were purposefully harsh. Prisoners were kept in chains below deck, all cramped together with nothing to keep them busy. No work, no entertainment. Minor offenses resulted in solitary confinement in the pitch-black cells in the bowels of the ship below the waterline. In 1853, with the appointment of John Price as the Inspector General of Penal Establishments, conditions became even worse on the hulks. Price took a personal interest in inflicting additional punishment upon prisoners. In March of 1857, Price went to Williamstown to discuss the many grievances reported by prisoners on the hulks. The meeting quickly turned into a riot. Prisoners threw stones and dirt at Price, then beat him with fists, feet, picks, and shovels. He died the following day. In 1885, the Victorian government decided that the prison hulks should be decommissioned. While the hulks were still serving as prisons, Melbourne Jail was functioning as well. It served as Melbourne's main prison until 1929. During that time, 133 inmates were hanged on sight, sometimes with a public audience. The prison incarcerated many well-known inmates, including Ned Kelly, the outlaw bushranger. Even with the hulks, there was prison overcrowding, so construction began on another prison just north of Melbourne, in what is now the suburb of Coburg. Her Majesty's Prison Pentridge, shortened to Pentridge Prison, was originally built to house the overflow of inmates from Melbourne Jail, and it became the main prison for Melbourne in 1924. Throughout its operation, it was infamous, known for its bluestone battlements, the notoriety of its prisoners, and the brutality of the punishments suffered by them. The first timber structures of Pentridge were built in 1850 to accommodate Melbourne Jail's overflowing population and house the labor force that was building Sydney Road. This first stage of the prison was a group of structures built by prison labor, using predominantly local materials. There were many escapes, which pushed Inspector General John Price to put forward a plan for a prison complex that was built of stone and could house around 1,400 prisoners. The structure would be built by the inmates themselves. After his death, the construction was supervised by newly appointed Inspector General William Champ. The design was based on the British Pentonville Prison in London, which in turn was based on the design of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. All three prisons used a relatively sophisticated system in which several prison wings radiated out from a central hall. This kept the prisoners isolated, but allowed the guards to keep an eye on the entire cell block. Each prisoner was isolated from the others and weren't allowed to speak. This was called the separate system. Another separate system structure was also part of this early phase of the prison, the panopticon. These were round cell blocks in which each individual cell faced a guard station. The prisoners in these cells were under total surveillance. At Pentridge, the panopticons were used as airing yards. A prisoner spent 23 hours a day alone in their small cells. For the last hour, they were taken blindfolded into a wedge-shaped airing yard for silent exercise and Bible reading. The yard had no roof and was overlooked by a central guard tower. The panopticons fell out of use due to prison overcrowding and were largely demolished in the early 1900s. Recently, archaeological excavation has revealed the foundations of one of these panopticons and the rubble remains of the other two. I'll talk more about that near the end of the episode. A blue stone wall surrounded the prison complex, encircling 130 acres. This wall was designed in a medieval fortification style. 2 towers stood on either side of an entrance arch at the front gate, and the walls were topped with crenellated battlements. Cruciform loopholes, which mimicked arrow slots, added to the castle-like appearance. This style was unique for the period and wasn't repeated anywhere else in Melbourne. The residents of the Pentridge area didn't like that the prison shared the name of their town, so they changed the town name to Coburg in 1870. Inspector General Champ believed prisoners ought to work while they were incarcerated. Pentridge therefore included a quarry where hard labor sentences generated stone for the buildings and a whole range of workshops, including a bootmaker, a galvanizing shed, tailors, wool manufacturers, and bookbinders. The idea was that this would reduce the cost of running the prison, generate in-house income, and aid in reforming the inmates. A women's wing was constructed within Pentridge between 1860 and 1865. This wing was connected to the central hall, the same as the male wings. A new separate female prison was constructed on the site between 1887 and 1894. Pentridge remained the main female prison in Victoria until 1956. Pentridge Prison was the largest prison complex in Victoria in the 19th century. The divisions of the prison itself and the punishments administered there changed with developments in the prison system. Here's a summary breakdown of the divisions and who was incarcerated there. As I mentioned, there was a women's wing, which was renamed A Division after the female prisoners were moved to their own separate wing. A Division then became the short and long-term prisoner wing for those who showed good behavior. Despite this, during the late 1980s until its closure in 1997, A Division was the scene of monthly bashings and stabbings between prisoners and sometimes between prisoners and guards. B Division held long-term prisoners with behavior problems. C Division held vagabonds and short-term prisoners. This is where Ned Kelly was imprisoned. In 1968, conditions in the C Division prison cells were found to be grossly outdated. Prisoners had only a blanket, a horsehair sleeping mat, and a bucket in their cells. There were no lavatories or electricity. C Division was demolished in early 1974. After the construction of Her Majesty's Prison Fairlea, an exclusively female prison, D Division became occupied by remand prisoners, those who couldn't make bail or refused bail and hadn't yet been charged. E Division was originally the hospital, but it was later turned into a short-term ward. F Division held both remand and short-term prisoners. G Division held prisoners with psychiatric problems. Following a series of escapes, the eastern section of A Division and the labor yards were sealed off to create a new maximum security section known as H Division. This division opened in 1958 and held Victoria's most troublesome, violent, and dangerous prisoners. J Division was the young offenders wing, but later included long-term, well-behaved prisoners. In the 1970s, there was a surge in prisoner-led activism. Prisoners allied with advocates of prison reform on the outside to publicize allegations of brutality used against them. Several prisoner rights groups also formed, such as the Prisoners' Legal Cooperative and the Prisoners' Action Group. In 1974, a Prisons Advisory Council was set up to oversee prison operations in Victoria. This occurred after an inquiry into prison guard brutality, which I'll get into in a moment. This council wanted to streamline classification and segregation of serious offenders. K Division, originally called Jika Jika, opened in 1980. This was a maximum security wing with complete separation of prisoners and guards and unprecedented surveillance. These were the most violent criminals, as well as those who had been targeted by other prisoners. Described as a jail within a jail, K Division was made up of a series of small cells meant to isolate prisoners. These were monitored 24/7 with CCTV, and cells were controlled electronically. Prisoners had no connection with the outside world. No windows, no natural light, and no other human contact, as the guards stayed in a control room. K Division was modeled after another prison, Katingal, which was part of Grafton Jail in New South Wales and was nicknamed the Electronic Zoo. However, even with its heavy security, in 1983, 4 prisoners escaped from K Division. The group were later caught and returned, but the division was under scrutiny. 4 years later, in 1987, inmates started a fire in K Division. The fire alarm sounded, sealing all the doors and windows. 5 prisoners suffocated to death. The division was closed immediately, a mere 8 years after opening, seen as not worth the cost and detrimental to the prisoners' sanity. Punishment was harsh. During the separate system era, every prisoner, no matter their crime or sentence, was initially put in solitary confinement in B Division. The length of their stay depended on their sentence, 1 month for every year they had been sentenced. All prisoners were expected to remain silent as they lived, slept, and worked in their cells. Cells included flushing toilets and wash basins, so the prisoners had no excuse to leave their cells. Cell doors included a peephole, so guards could observe inmates at random intervals. The internal structure of the prison wings ensured separation of the prisoners, both physical and sensory. The walls were so thick that sound was muffled from neighboring cells. Thick mats carpeted the corridors to dampen the footfalls of guards. The soles of the guard boots were coated in felt, enabling them to approach the peepholes in the cell doors without detection. This meant the prisoners had to assume they were being watched at all times. After they had served their allotted time in B Division under the separate system, prisoners were moved to C Division, which was run using the silent system. Prisoners could see and work with other inmates, but were not permitted to speak. They were expected to work for 13 hours a day and spend the remaining hours in tiny cells without lights, windows, heating, or toilets. These were called sleeping cells. They were deemed unfit for human occupation in 1880, but stayed in use without alteration until the 1970s. Due to overcrowding, these small cells occasionally held more than one inmate. This type of psychological punishment affected every aspect of the prisoner's daily life. Even in the common exercise yards, they had to wear masks so that they couldn't recognize each other. When talking to the warden, they had to use their prison number and not their name. Apart from the silence and isolation, Victorian prisons in the 1800s commonly employed the lash. Prisoners could receive up to 25 lashes for minor infringements and 50 for more serious crimes. Those being lashed were tied to a 3-beamed triangle and dealt the blows. Lashings would often strip the flesh from a man's back, and many became seriously ill or died due to infection and shock from the pain. A form of punishment in the 1800s was a device known as the treadmill. It was a long, cylindrical wheel that a row of prisoners was secured to by a handrail. The prisoners had to pedal the wheel to grind large blocks of bluestone into gravel. These areas of the prison where this punishment occurred were called the rock-breaking yards. Blisters on their hands and injuries to their feet and legs occurred often. If a prisoner refused to run the treadmill, they were put in solitary confinement instead. Only 11 executions took place at Pentridge, compared to the 133 that occurred at the old Melbourne jail. The last execution at Pentridge was also the last execution in Australia. In 1967, Ronald Ryan was hanged in D Division at 8 a.m. on February 3rd after shooting dead prison officer George Hodson during an escape from the prison. Later that day, Ryan's body was buried in an unmarked grave within the D Division prison facility. Pentridge's H Division, which opened in 1958, was notorious as the place where the worst of the worst were held. Regulations inside were stringent and dehumanizing. A transfer to H Division often resulted in an indefinite sentence of solitary confinement. H Division was known among the prisoners as the slot, a torturous cell block held under the harshness of military discipline, solitary confinement, and hard manual labor. Many officers in H Division were ex-military. They were trained to deal with sudden outbursts of violence, which were common in H Division, both from prisoners and officers. Some officers were fair in their treatment of prisoners, but most were reported to be drunk on the power they held over the prisoners. Many prisoners reported being beaten upon arrival, a ritual the prisoners called the reception biff. The new prisoner was made to run naked up and down the division while officers took swings at them with their guard sticks. If the prisoner was knocked unconscious, they were chained to the staircase and left for a few hours. Prisoners were ordered to memorize a booklet of divisional rules during their first night. Illiteracy was cruelly mocked and punished. H Division uniforms had targets painted on them, because if an H Division prisoner was seen at any time without an officer escorting them, the rest of the prison officers were given leave to shoot them on sight. Prisoners reported that a daily beating, called the bash, was carried out by prison officers as a disciplinary practice. The beatings, which were carried out with guard sticks, fists, and feet, could continue for several hours and could occur at any time of the day or night, leaving prisoners in perpetual fear. The sound of the beatings was not muffled, so that all other prisoners could hear it happening. Those in A Division, which was one of the better ones to be in, could hear everything, as only a single wall stood between them and H Division. H Division prisoners reported various forms of terrorization, sadistic and degrading treatment, sexual humiliation, and harassment by officers during their time. Small cruelties, such as officers blowing cigarette smoke into prison cells when cigarettes were banned, tearing the endings out of all the books in the prison library, watching as letters from their families were torn up, and being forced to salute the chief officer's cat. The work done by prisoners in H Division was manual rock breaking, using sledgehammers and picks to turn blocks of blue stone into gravel. The rock-breaking yards had no roofs, so if it rained, prisoners got wet, and as the blue stone walls held on to heat and cold, they would bake in the summer and freeze in the winter for the rest of the day, as they had no change of clothes. Prisoners were fed quite well to make sure they could break rocks all day, but any misbehavior often resulted in a reduction in food. All prisoners in H Division had to remain silent. If they needed to speak to a guard, for example to get permission to use the toilet, they had to stand on an X on the floor and wait with their heads down to be spoken to. Prisoners would be beaten by any number of prison guards if they failed to comply with any orders. Beatings were used as a method of interrogation or to extract confessions of real or imagined crimes. Officers essentially forced prisoners to confess to crimes such as rape against other prisoners, humiliating them as well as brutalizing them. It was reported that officers sometimes poured buckets of human waste over prisoners and refused to let them wash. The use of torture and humiliation were a deliberate psychological part of the process in H Division. Staying sane was difficult, and any prisoners who were deemed to have gone insane were sent to J Ward at Ararat Asylum, which I talked about in our episode on Victorian lunatic asylums. Once the prisoner was stable, they were sent back to H Division. Their time in J Ward did not count toward their sentence. Former chaplain Peter Norden reported the shocking tales he heard from the prisoners he counseled. Rape, humiliation, isolation, and dehumanization were rampant. He stated that he was told the brutal truth because he was the only person in the prison that the prisoners could trust, as they couldn't trust each other, the staff, or the guards. Prisoner self-harm and suicide attempts were common. At one point, many prisoners took their own lives in solidarity in order to draw attention and force an inquiry into the conditions of H Division. In 1972, the Jenkinson Board of Inquiry was appointed to investigate prisoner allegations of abuse. At the time, there were no surveillance cameras, so prisoner accounts served as evidence of abuses at H Division. During the inquiry, prison officials and officers denied all allegations of systemic brutality in H Division. Prisoners who provided evidence during the inquiry were largely discredited through vilifying stereotypes associated with criminality, violence, and dangerousness. The prisoners' criminal records, prison conduct records, and individual pathologies were used against them. The right to define reality or truth is not equally distributed. The powerful, in this context the prison authorities and departmental officials, hold a monopoly over what constitutes as the facts. Overall, Jenkinson's findings listed the names of 5 prisoners and 5 prison officers with regard to proven allegations of brutality. Each of the 5 officers worked in H Division at the time of the allegations, but the board had not been able to ascertain their identities. Prison officers uniformly denied any participation in or knowledge of unlawful violence committed against prisoners by prison officers. They admitted to occasionally resorting to lawful force to maintain order in the division. Officers also argued that the objective of H Division was to enforce a military-style regime upon the prisoners. The prisoners resented this, and upon release magnified their own hardiness and reputations by telling tall tales about the brutalism of H Division and its warders. Jenkinson put prisoner credibility into question on the basis of criminal and prison records. Jenkinson also characterized the proven instances of brutality in H Division as understandable, given the exceptional circumstances the officers faced. He listed unprecedented psychological pressures and the constant threat to their personal safety from prisoners. At the end of the inquiry, no H Division prison officers were charged. In the 1980s, another inquiry occurred within H Division. Australia's history of racism, which is deeply connected to its colonial past, was thrown into the public eye. Photographs of prison officers posing in Ku Klux Klan-style hoods were leaked to the media. Allegations emerged that the guards had used them to terrorize Aboriginal and Maori prisoners, along with cross-burnings and nighttime visits to cells. Some of these attacks involved beatings and placing naked prisoners of color in observation cells. Photographic evidence forced authorities to act. Several officers were charged with misconduct. Re-examination of prison management and prisoner treatment in Australia soon followed. Repressive maximum security units such as H Division and practices of violence and torture against prisoners had become normalized over the years, which led to the intensification of security measures within prisons and even more brutal treatment, such as K Division. This normalization of increasingly repressive maximum security units was called into question. In the 80s, the Victorian government began experimenting with moving prisons into the private sector. The idea was that the free market was the most effective way of allocating the scarce resources involved in prisons. The government created a comprehensive privatization model, where the government would purchase prison services from private groups who would finance, design, construct, and manage the actual prisons. The model was tested in 3 prisons in Victoria. The result of this experiment was better performance accountability and standards and government cost savings. The prison system is still evolving today, with old habits dying hard and the reform process moving slowly. In 1997, part of Pentridge Prison was closed as part of the government's decision to privatize prisons. Most prisoners were relocated to Her Majesty's Prison, Barwon. The rest of the prison was closed in 1999, and the land was sold to developers. It sat derelict for many years while both the National Trust and private companies tried to figure out what to do with it. The site was eventually split into 2, Pentridge Coburg and Pentridge Village. Parts of the front gate, walls, and several divisions were marked for historical preservation. In 2007, Pentridge Coburg was developed. The old Pentridge Stockade area to the east of what is now Stockade Avenue became a housing development, leaving the Pentridge Piazza and all the Bluestone Heritage buildings in need of maintenance and restoration. Things remained quiet on the site until 2013, when J Division was demolished. Plans for the development of Pentridge Village also began. During this process, archaeological works were completed around the prison. Dig International focused on the buried foundations of C Division and the exercise yards of A and B Divisions. The old panopticons were unearthed, as were the remains of prisoners that had died at Melbourne Jail and were then relocated to Pentridge. Ned Kelly's remains were included in that discovery, except for his skull, which remains undiscovered. The historic prison buildings that remained were stabilized and restored. In 2016, the Pentridge Open Day was held to celebrate the reopening of the prison as a museum exhibit. About 8,000 locals visited Pentridge that day. It was the first time people had seen the prison since its closure. A whole commercial precinct developed around the surviving buildings. A luxury hotel and spa, a cinema, a brewery, shopping center, and restaurants were built around the historical site. Most of the bluestone walls were reused as parts of other buildings. Developers felt that including them in the new developments was a way to keep the history and glow up the area at the same time. Tours of the remaining historical parts of Pentridge are plentiful. Both B Division and H Division are open for tours. I went on both after doing research for this episode and still learned a lot. My tour guides, Sunny and Chris, were excellent, both in knowledge and compassion for the plight of both prisoners and guards. I learned about punishment during the stockade era of the prison, which included sensory deprivation in cells painted entirely black on the inside, and grave sitting, in which the prisoner was lowered in a coffin into a grave and had to stay there all day. I learned about the many escape attempts from the early days to the 80s. Only one person successfully escaped and was never recaptured. In 1901, John Henry Sparks, the Rutherglen Highway robber, escaped and was never seen again. I learned that the last flogging to occur at Pentridge was in 1957. This punishment was ordered for William O'Meally and John Taylor, who had both managed to walk out the front gate one day. Both men received 12 strokes from a cat of nine tails. Flogging was banned after this, and the need for a maximum security division was recognized and ultimately led to the construction of H Division. I learned of the inventiveness involved in sneaking drugs into Pentridge using tennis balls, and the theatrical productions put on by the inmates of A Division. I learned that art therapy was the best thing for many inmates, as it helped them express the emotions they weren't allowed to speak. Pentridge Prison has a dark history, as do many prisons all across the world. Murderers, thieves, and other criminals all locked together under strict guard quickly creates an environment ripe for revolt. Prison systems in Australia are trying to move from places of punishment to places of reform and rehabilitation, and some do function that way today. However, many still have a long way to go. The oldest prisons, such as Pentridge, were sites of pain, cruelty, and death. The fact that humans kill fascinates us. The fact that those humans were tortured in the name of justice by other humans astounds us. And the fact that this treatment is often hushed up disgusts and enrages us, which is why prisons like Pentridge spark so many emotions, all starting with curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Julie, Lolly, Hales, Danielle, Betty, May, Lala, Sarah B, Holly R, Jess W, Lindsay S, Dagmar, Danalisa, Marissa D, Andrea R, Matt K, Deb, and Jonathan Blood all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the free Patreon members as well. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.